Thanks, guys, for joining Akto's webinar. Welcome you all. Today's topic is especially very important for us. It's API documentation. Who doesn't want a great API documentation? So today's topic is importance of API documentation in API security. And our guest today is Frank Kilcommins. Frank is, I think he has the largest experience in Swagger, 15 years it's been. He's also the governing board member of OpenAPI Spec, if I'm OpenAPI Foundation. Him, actually, I found on a blog, he wrote a blog, I think a couple of months back on API workflows feature that you guys released, and I read that. I found it really amazing, and I saw that, okay, you wrote it, and that's how I reached out to you. You don't know the story, Frank, but that's how I reached out to you, and I'm so glad that we have you finally here at Akto's webinar. Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And we have over here Ankush. He's my founder and CTO of Akto. What is the agenda for today? Very quick look. We'll discuss about the critical role of API documentation in API security. And then Frank will walk us through the what and why of API documentation, challenges of documentation, and how to improve your API documentation. So there's going to be a lot of talk just about API documentation. And finally, how to automate API documentation with Akto. So it's going to be a 45 minutes webinar. Sit through and ask as many questions as possible. Keep it interactive. We'll keep answering the questions in the chat. All right. So very quick overview of what is Akto. This is Akto, so it makes sense to know more about Akto. It's the world's only open source proactive API security platform. And our mission is to secure every API before deployment. And for that, we do API discovery and API security testing. API discovery essentially means you have a way to automate your API documentation, and that's the topic of today. We were founded 2 years ago. Our headquarters is SF. Here is a little bit of Twitter and GitHub profile. We'll talk more about Akto, but today we'll discuss API documentation. All right. At this stage, before Frank starts deep discussion on API documentation, so why are we talking about API documentation if we are talking about API security, right? And here is why. It's been 2 years for us in this space, and we've talked to about like 1,000 plus developers, 500 plus security teams, about 200 plus organizations, and this is the common problem that every organization has. About 70% of the organizations don't have a way to have a complete and updated API documentation. Now, what does that mean for a security team, for a security engineer? For a security engineer who's trying to secure APIs, they don't know how to secure APIs if they don't have API assets. They don't know what the shadow APIs are, what are my internal APIs, external APIs, partner, third-party APIs. If I don't have that information, how will I even know if an API is vulnerable? How will I secure those APIs? And that brings us to this discussion that how can I get API documentation to start my API security journey? And with that, I'll give the stage to Frank, who will start with the what and why of API documentation. Before we start, guys, go ahead, ask as many questions as possible. This is an interactive discussion. We'll ask a lot of questions from Frank also. So please make it as interactive as possible. Great.
Yeah, great.
Over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so I always think it's just good to maybe take a little step back before we drill into kind of the security aspects of the documentation, and just to kind of level set on what is API documentation, how do we think about it, why do we put the effort into creating API documentation. So for me, API documentation really it's a human readable description of how developers will enable machines to communicate with each other. And if we think about, who it's for, and you can advance the slide if you want, really it's targeted predominantly at developers, so at humans who will be doing the work of integrating some capabilities into their system. But we also need to be aware that in the modern climate of how APIs have kind of proliferated into every aspect of our lives with digital transformation, there's also many non-developers who are stakeholders, and they need to be able to find and understand the API documentation to determine if it's worthwhile on investing this API into their organization rather than maybe building their own version of the same capabilities. Over the last year and a half or so, we have also seen an explosion in a new type of API consumer, and that is the AI consumer. And they're also relying on documentation to be able to automate and ingest an API. And that's why it comes forward in kind of some of the future slides around the human readability and the machine readability aspect of some of the formats and mechanisms that we use to draft good API documentation. When we're also building APIs and thinking about the docs, we need to understand where will these APIs be exposed and who will be the consumer. So are they internal only consumers, or are they external consumers, or a mixture of both? And that will also help us understand what type of documentation we will create, what types of authentication and authorization mechanisms we will employ, whether or not we can share proprietary information, or we need to create a more polished kind of value attributed version of the documentation for external consumers. And when I think about the anatomy of documentation, you can go on to the next slide, please. We kind of break it down into three buckets. So of course we have the technical reference documentation. So that is, specifications like OpenAPI or Async API or RAMO or something else. We have all of the data types and the models that are included in that, the endpoints where these APIs are accessible, any system requirements and examples to try and help the developer understand how these things are going to work. And that's very much a machine and human readable version of documentation. But then we have some additional elements of documentation as well. So we have the concepts. So this is really talking about, and this is targeted at both the developer and non-developer personas, what's the API all about? How do you get started with getting access to this API? So it's really kind of forcing you to be clear about your taxonomy. And then what are the tasks? So what can the API do? What is it good at? And how, as a developer, can I chain this API into my system and as hopefully as quickly as possible get it integrated so that I can start reaping the rewards and the value. So next slide, please. And of course, this is all targeted at selling the bigger value proposition. So for me, an API is always a means to an end. It's a conduit for getting value from one place to another. And in a way that allows the machines to exchange that value. But up until quite recently, it's still predominantly humans who do all of the work. And so we need to be able to teach potential API consumers, be they internal employees, be they external customers or partners, about the products and the APIs that we offer. That's also giving us a very good way to define the appropriate boundaries with regards to what APIs live in what area, where they're going to be exposed, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. And of course, we want to enable self-service. So hopefully we want to put enough value into the documentation to allow consumers to be able to onboard and seamlessly integrate without having to stand up a really big customer support operation just to be able to allow folks to integrate. And of course, that opens up the ability for us to be able to market specific products into specific marketplaces, and think about embedded finance as a huge marketplace where the API consumption of capabilities into super apps and other experiences is a game changer. But it's not just about creating documentation, and it's not just that simple. Of course, curating good documentation comes with lots of challenges. And one of the main things that we also need to understand in the API climate in general is the sheer volume increase that's happening in the amount of APIs that we're producing. So building more APIs, that's going to cause additional security concerns, as additional operational concerns. I see Anko shooting questions, so you can feel free to jump in at any point in time.
Yeah, Frank, we already have a few questions from our audience in the chat box. So one of them is API documentation. Should it be API gateway dependent or any enterprise architecture tool dependent or agnostic of any such tools?
I think optimally you want it to be tooling agnostic. So you will want to choose mechanisms of crafting your API documentation that bake that resiliency into your architecture so that you're not, let's say, completely pigeonholed with a particular technical stack. That's why we will start talking about the power of API specifications. So, of course, specifications are safely delivered and managed in the open. So, for example, with OpenAPI, and that being kind of the most popular specification for describing reference documentation for REST or REST-ish APIs, that's managed under the Linux Foundation, so it's independent of any vendor. And so if you're crafting documentation and technical reference documentation for REST or REST-ish APIs, that's a very good place to start. It means that you will be sufficiently independent of any other tooling choices that you make in your architecture, but you're also benefiting from there being a very rich tooling ecosystem that will support you across the different phases of delivering an API. So for the technical reference documentation, definitely specifications. For, let's say, the additional content that supports that, I would say, choose something like Markdown, because again, that keeps you sufficiently agnostic of tooling choices and vendors.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Frank.
Cool. Yeah, so we're all producing more and more APIs, and we're kind of getting into the realm of these terms like API sprawl. Now, I don't think that's something to be scared about because we're in the business of, building tools or building APIs. So we want to build more of these things, but we need to be able to manage the increase in API production and not have the negative connotations of something like sprawl. So I kind of equate it often from a metaphoric perspective to like town planning. So yes, you want your city to grow, but you also want it to thrive, and you want to make sure that the services are there to keep the people happy. And the same should happen within your API landscape. You want more APIs to be there. You want to help people solve problems, but you want to have the right planning and processes in place to be able to deliver them to production safely. So some of these stats here are very interesting, I think, and quite scary to a certain degree. So the first one, which I can share the findings and the reports that these come from after, but 51% of APIs that are out there in production do not have any form of authentication, not even basic auth, which is, I almost prefer not to think about it too hard. And the next one is that 30% of internet traffic is generated by malicious bots. And I actually see that Forbes published an article earlier this week, and it was an Imprevia Bad Bots report for 2024. And it says that human traffic is now just about 50% of internet traffic. And actually in Ireland, so that's where I'm based, bad bots are generating 71% of internet traffic, which is quite a staggering statistic. And because of that, because of all of these, malicious actors, and because we're producing more APIs, so we're exposing more of our surface area towards the internet, it's not surprising that 60% of organizations have suffered an API breach in the last 2 years. And actually the average cost of those breaches was north of $4 million each. So getting hacked is not a nice experience for anyone, and definitely even not for the bottom line. So you can move on, please. So what I would say is that documentation really is a must-have to have a better posture when it comes to security and being able to know and understand your API estate. And doing so thoughtfully really can help you avoid many of the exploits. So you can catch where you have non-existent or inconsistent authorization mechanisms. It helps you to just miss those mistakes. So if you have a good process around documentation and you're documenting let's say the concept, as I mentioned, for explaining how someone will get up and running with your API, if you find that your technical writers or whomever is responsible for that are actually not describing, or they're not asked to describe how you get access to client credentials to generate bearer tokens, or they're not even asked to provide information around how you get an API key, then that should be a red flag. It probably means that there's no auth fundamentally as part of the API. If we can have documentation, we have a better mechanism to be able to discover APIs, and that can help us improve reuse. So it's less likely that we will be building multiple versions of these APIs. The older versions will eventually fall into what we call zombie APIs. So building a good catalog of APIs is something that can also allow us to really understand the estate and the portfolio that we're trying to manage. And of course, with that visibility, we're reducing duplication, and we're also ensuring that we can reduce the overall risk of the APIs that we're exposing. So we want the APIs to be discovered, we want them to be adopted, and we want to be able to do so in kind of a controlled manner and mechanism. And when it comes to kind of the technical aspects, which I think most of the audience here will probably be interested in, so they're responsible for actually building APIs or consuming APIs and crafting the technical documentation. There's lots of challenges out there with regards to how you can do this. So from an industry perspective, yes, we have specifications, but how can we make sure that we're not missing anything when we're drafting these technical documents? And the most common challenges that are out there are missing endpoints. So we might be thoughtful and deliberate about the documentation the first time through the cycle. But if we have a successful API, then we have an API that's long living. So it's in production for a long time. We're probably going to be changing and enhancing that over time. So we're going to be adding more capabilities into that API. And if we don't keep the documentation in sync with the implementation, then we are leaving ourselves open to security misses and security exploits. If we're not being very deliberate about our models, so if we're a little bit lazy with regards to how we craft the different JSON schemas that are associated with the different endpoints, then again, that could hinder our ability to be able to apply validation rules. I think errors are one of the most forgotten about aspects of APIs from a documentation perspective. So we focus on that happy path way too often, and we don't do enough time explaining the non-happy paths. And effectively being able to deliver bad news is a critical aspect of delivering robust APIs. So we need to be able to communicate all of the expected response codes and paths and use mechanisms to do so in a consistent manner. And of course, if we're not clear around authentication and authorization and having kind of robust mechanisms for doing that, then that's going to hinder us long term. And what I would say is, friends don't let friends roll their own auth. So, we should make sure that we're using industry standards with regards to the security mechanisms for APIs as well. Okay, so enough about kind of some of the challenges that are out there. How can we improve, and what are the steps that we can make to have a better security posture with our API documentation? And what I would also say is we're all trying to get before we get into production. And the way I always look at it is if we get an issue in a design, then it's a pencil and eraser type of fix that we need to apply. Whereas if we only encounter that issue in production, then it's more of a sledgehammer approach with regards to the fixes that we need to do. So we want to be able to shift left on API governance in general, and also specifically the security aspect of API governance, because API design really can have an impact on the security of your API. And it's all too easy for a flawed design to get out there, and by default, you will expose attack vectors in ways that you never even imagined were potentially possible. So for me, shifting left on security governance means that we adopt a secure by design approach. So we have to be aware of what's known as the law of instrument. So every time we need to build an API, we need to understand what is the intended problem that we're trying to solve, who are the users or the demographic that are interested in the solution to this problem, and then make sure that we pick the correct API style to solve that problem. So maybe just because we're only ever building RESTful APIs, that doesn't mean that REST style for every single problem. So we need to be aware of the other flavors and styles of APIs that are out there and make sure that we don't just use the mechanisms that are comfortable for us as a provider. We need to solve the problem in the most effective way for our consumers. We always should have very good mechanisms for validating the designs, making sure we're not cluttering endpoints or producing vague models so we're bleeding too much data out in the different endpoints. And there's mechanisms for us to check against common vulnerable design pitfalls, things like unbounded arrays or leaking objects, unrestricted filters, lack of pagination, and so forth. There's mechanisms for us to have opinions on that right at the point of design before any code is even built. And we'll get a little bit into some of the tooling that can help as we progress through. And what I would say is anyone here who's really coming from an application security background, really try to get close and try to embed yourself with your teams that are building APIs. The earlier you can get involved in the process, the earlier you can provide feedback, and means that we will have a more robust result from the outset. Next slide, please. Cool. So there's kind of I think 5 or 6 kind of tips here that we'll be kind of running through. And the first I would say is that we should bet on the use of specifications. So don't invent our own ways for crafting API reference documentation. Use the industry standards that are out there. There's a number of reasons for us to be able to do that. And probably the most prominent one is it will make your life easier as an API practitioner, because you will benefit from the rich tooling ecosystem that's there. It also means that all of the different stakeholders who are involved in producing an API, I mean the designers, the architects, the tech writers, the developers, the testers, the product managers, you have this common artifact that you can all agree upon and circle around, and that will be your point of truth that will guide you towards production. And of course, then you have the ability through the tooling to be able to automate many of the stops along the development lifecycle. So you can work in parallel, but you can also make sure that you can use your CI/CD pipelines to validate that you're keeping on the straight and narrow, so the implementation is matching the design, documentation is added at the right point in time, and all of the rules and the style guides that you want to apply from your company perspective are being linted continuously along the process. So next slide, please. And again, that also improves the life for API consumers, because consumers then also benefit from these standards and they have ways of making the API come to life. So you'll have tools like Swagger UI, which of course will render open API and documents. There's lots more out there. There's like Elements from Spectral. We Dockley have tools. You'll be afforded lots of choice along your API journey, and because you have betted on specifications being at the core of what you do. So it improves the provider lifecycle, but equally it also improves the consumer lifecycle. And again, when you're dealing with gateways from the publishing perspective, gateways also can parse and understand these common industry standards.
Yeah. Frank, I think one more very big advantage of having a Swagger or an OpenAPI spec file is we get the client-side SDKs automatically generated, which also goes a great way in implementing any kind of a mobile app or using the APIs in web app as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It really can bootstrap many of the work that needs to be done, both on the provider side, but I would say even more so on the consumer side as well. So you can start generating the clients or the sample SDKs to ingest the value and the functionality that's on offer as quickly as possible into your application, and that really can go a long way to kind of reducing the barrier to entry and reducing that mean time to integration, which is so important from an API consumer perspective. And these are just some examples here. We could have created 20 slides. And if you're focused on OpenAPI, you can go to the tools.openapi.org website, which is like the standard OpenAPI website where we list all of the tools that support OpenAPI across all different facets of the API provider lifecycle and consumer lifecycle. And so there's a tool out there for every programming language combination, basically. And again, what I would say is that it also supports, a design first workflow and a code first workflow. So not everyone has kind of organized themselves around getting a clear design, and then only from there moving into development. There's SDKs there that can also help you annotate your code to be able to produce the artifacts that will then allow you to start integrating with the broader tool set. Linting and validating your APIs, I think this is a crucial part of governance. So if you just build one API, then that's fine. More often than not, as I said, we're all in the process of building lots of APIs across our teams and our organizations. So we want to make sure that there's a certain amount of consistency with regards to the APIs that we produce. And again, if we have strong opinions on security by design from an API design point of view, we can also use some of the linting tools that are out there to give us feedback right at that design point in the process with regards to how robust our design is from a security perspective. So Spectral is probably the most common and that's out there. So that's an open source linter from Stoplight. And there's lots of, let's say, style guides that are then built on top of that linting capability. So number one, it'll tell you, is the reference document that you created valid from an open API perspective? And then you can have all of your customized opinions on how you want your parameters to look like. And then there's other industry style guides, like, for example, the OWASP Top 10, which will then give you feedback on how your APIs are performing against as many of that top 10 as you can have an opinion on from a static perspective. So there's some that you can't have an opinion on until you get into the runtime, but at least it will cover lots of the let's say the poor design pitfalls that I mentioned a few slides earlier. The benefit is you get feedback as you're designing the API, but you also get feedback as part of your CI/CD. So again, you can have to validate along the different lifecycle steps if you are keeping all of your checks and balances in the right order. And once you're happy that you've kind of built a good API, right before you publish and even during that kind of design phase, you need to think about how you deliver that bad news effectively. And errors, as I mentioned, is always something that's often overlooked. But there's some good standards out there with regards to how we communicate and how we should communicate errors. And again, this is pigeonholed specifically at HTTP APIs, but there is an RFC 9457, formerly RFC 7807, which focuses on problem details for HTTP APIs. So it gives you a very, very good mechanism to consistently deliver error responses through your APIs. And again, that's something that you can lint for and validate. So if I was to say what are some critical kind of non-happy path and status codes, it would be some of the 400 series ones, obviously, things around bad client requests. So something like a 400 or a 422 if there was just something wrong or malformed with the request. Obviously, anything got to do with access to the endpoint or the resources, so 401 and 403. And of course, then if we do things incorrectly on our server side, so some of the 500 series responses are also critical. And when you have an opinion and a style guide for how API should look like within your organization, then you can quickly scan across all the designs that you have to see, okay, how many resource endpoints here are not at least providing these 5 bad or negative path codes, and then that's something that you can immediately inform the team of. So I'd encourage everyone to check out that RFC, become familiar with it, and try to get it into your organization moving forward.
Yeah. Frank, I have a question around status 429. So usually when we start testing the APIs, the idea is we should not bombard a lot of requests on APIs which are not supposed to handle a lot of traffic. So there are usually headers which tell the client that these are the rate limits that you should follow. Like per minute, you cannot fire more than 30 requests. And right now you already consumed like 25 requests or so. Is there a special section within Open API spec where we can highlight the information around rate limiting of the APIs? Like, can we document that?
You would more or less document that as part of your response. So you would say this was 429, and then you could link out to another part of the documentation where you would explicitly talk about your rate limiting. It's not natively covered within the spec, but you can add in either your own custom extension to document your rate limiting, let's say processes or the different quotas that you may offer. But generally that would be advertised up front with the API documentation, a bit like how you might describe pagination, and that will be kind of common across all of your APIs as well. But yeah, rate limiting is obviously something that has to be there. It's very important, and also making that work right with the gateways is a recommended approach. But there's standard HTTP headers for how you communicate, how long someone must kind of wait before they retry again, and you can also advertise potentially how much of their quota they have remaining if folks want to kind of know upfront how close they are to hitting the 429 type of situation.
Got it. Thank you, Frank.
And there's always a trade-off, because of course if you're exposing how many calls you have left before you get a 429, then someone can say, okay, well, I'm going to just wait now before I hit the API again. But there'll be different situations where you have different requirements with regards to rate limiting. So being able to kind of produce good API documentation is, of course, very critical. But then you also need to be able to catalog and manage the entire portfolio of APIs that you have. And I think this is even becoming more important now, as many have a multi-gateway approach. So it's not like we have the luxury of publishing all our APIs to a single gateway, but we also need to manage APIs that are being published to multiple gateways, and APIs that are in progress and maybe not yet published to a gateway. So having a mechanism to catalog APIs, I think, is critically important. If that catalog also supports your governance needs and can give you feedback on how different APIs are scoring with regards to being abiding by the different governance needs or linting requirements that you have, is great. If it supports multiple API specifications, even better. And there's quite a lot of tools out there. Of course, I'm from SmartBear, so Swagger Hub is one of the tools, but there are many tools out there that allow you to catalog your API documentation and then decide where you want to publish them. There's some other interesting specifications out there, like APIs.json, which tackle, I think, a broader spectrum of requirements and concerns across the API lifecycle, and also allow you to catalog some of the operational information across your full API portfolio. And again, that's an open standard that's out there. Support for it is being built into certain tools, but again, I would encourage folks to check that out when you want to have, let's say, an overseeing approach to your documentation at scale across a full portfolio. And that allows you to link lots of different artifacts together to give kind of a total view of different perspectives of the API lifecycle for different stakeholders. And then we have everything ready and we want to make the API available for consumers. So we need to start thinking about publishing APIs to gateways. So of course, the Open API specification and specifications like that allow us to publish to gateways. And if we also have maybe gone a different path and we have our APIs already in gateways, well, then different gateways offer different mechanisms of allowing us to kind of go down the reverse path. So we can export an API that's been kind of maybe hand-rolled and manually published into a gateway, export that as an Open API definition, put that back into our governance wheelhouse, and get an opinion on how, let's say, how much of this API is conforming to our rules and our governance. And that allows us to then score it and then determine what the next step should be to make it more aligned with our new needs or our new requirements. So maybe just to quickly recap, let's say for anyone who's looking to decide how they can improve their security posture for APIs, I'd say start with governance. Make sure that you can have a mechanism to catalog the different types of APIs that you're producing. And for that, you should bank on user specifications. So even for RESTful APIs, event-driven APIs, query-based APIs, there's specifications out there for all of them. As a security professional, make sure that you work closely with your API teams to provide input as quickly as possible. And as I said, you can use various OWASP rule sets along with the governance linting to help surface those feedbacks or those points earlier in the process. API documentation is an absolute must. If we don't have documentation, we really don't know what APIs we have. We can't have a mechanism to discover them and secure them. And then we need to also ensure that we're having a better security posture pre-production wise as well as post-production wise, because it's cheaper to fix things the earlier we find them, of course. And we can't delegate API security testing onto other layers in our architecture, be that the consuming UIs or consuming mobile apps, or even hopefully never onto the API consumer to find these security vulnerabilities for us. But I think, having the documentation sets us up very, very well to have a good security posture. But of course, it's not going to work for everybody because there is work involved in getting the documentation there. And then I'll hand back to you, Akita, who's going to talk about what we can do in the absence of having a way to produce the documentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Frank. This was amazing. Before I start on, how to automate API documentation, I'll just go through the chat and see if there's any question for Frank. I think there's one. Is it API documentation? I don't think you covered this. Is it same as microservices, nanoservices documentation? Somebody thinks SaaS. He asked this question.
Yeah, whether we classify an API as a microservice or a monolithic service, I think is all in the eye of the beholder. At the end of the day, it's a service that we're making available to a consumer, and therefore we should be documenting how that particular service works, what the security expectations are, what the let's say what the responses will look like, what all of the expectations a consumer can expect from that API. So we need to document it. So if we classifying it as a microservice or as a monolithic service, it shouldn't really matter. The same requirements hold true.
Awesome. So let's move on to what's the automated way to generate Swagger with sample value. So we've talked a lot about API documentation, how to write good API documentation, challenges of it, how to improve those. But we still don't have a way to automate our API documentation. That's what we're going to talk about today. We at Akto do exactly that. We automate API documentation, and this is how you do it. I'll show a quick demo also. Once you sign up on Akto has about 20 plus traffic connectors, which works in this way that Akto takes traffic from your cloud. If you're in AWS, GCP, Azure, it will take a stream of duplicated traffic from your cloud and send it to Akto dashboard, which will then process it and create an API inventory. And it's done in an automated and continuous way. So once you've connected the traffic connector, that's it. You don't have to do anything else. Anytime there's a new API or an old API has changed, everything will get reflected in the dashboard in terms of API inventory. What you can do now is you can click on download an open API spec. So anytime you want an updated open API spec, go to Akto dashboard and download it. And I'll show you a quick demo of it. So I'll go to my demo environment and show you how it works. So here we are in Akto. If you deploy Akto, you will go to quick start screen, and here we have some traffic connectors. You can use Kubernetes daemon set. It is the most recommended and used traffic connector. Once we connect it using we have some documentation over here that you can use for Kubernetes daemon set. All the traffic will flow into Akto, and there will be a lot of API collections form over here. I'll go to one of these, and these are basically your API inventory. So this is a demo app. I have all my APIs over here that Akto has detected through traffic. What I can do is, for API documentation, I can just export it as an open API spec file. And once I click on this, that's it. I have my updated Swagger file ready. So anytime as a developer or as a security engineer, I want an updated API Swagger file, I just come to Akto and I download it, and I will have the latest Swagger file available with me. So this is very simple, and that's what Akto does. I'll leave you guys over there. You can set up a 15-minute demo with me. There's a link over here. I'll put the link in the chat as well. And we can go more about how we use then API documentation to do API security testing and it in CI/CD. For every time you are deploying an API, you will be able to test your APIs before they are put in production. So that's it, guys. This was our webinar. I'll just see if there are any questions. So yeah, Divyansh, you've asked a few.
There is.
Yeah,
there is one. Should there be only one API documentation of internal or external purposes if the APIs are common?
Yeah, Frank, you want to take it?
Yeah, well, it will be different maybe for different organizations, but if I was to say my opinion or my preference would be, if you have an API that's going to be serving internal consumers as well as external consumers, strive to have a single version of the documentation and try to ensure that you can have that as secure as possible so that it can serve the needs of exposing that outside of your organization. And hopefully, again, that won't be too much of a lift for your internal developers. I think it's always a good practice to craft APIs and think about APIs in a way that at some point in time they might be exposed to the external world. That just keeps you more sharply focused on having it externalizable from the start, rather than having to kind of break internal consumers as you want to make this API available for externals, or maybe even worse, creating another version of an API, because we have to be very careful of major version proliferation. So as much as possible, strive to get the design extendable and be able to cater for external and internal consumers from the outset.
Awesome. There's another question. Does adding Akto traffic connected add latency to my app? And the answer is no, it doesn't. Ankush has answered this also. It does not sit in line. It only listens to the traffic and copy it, analyzes it. So there's no latency. All right, there's another question, I think.
There's one in the chat, Ankita. That says, Ankita, so as you said, it duplicates the automated traffic and generate the documentation based on that.
Many
will Akto keep on changing the parameters every time a different parameter call was done, or that's not the case? I can take it. Yeah. So the Open API spec that Akto generates, it's according to the latest API schema that we see in your traffic. So, for example, if you've added like 2 new fields as part of your latest release, Akto will capture it. And now, if you export an Open API spec file through Akto, it will contain the 2 new parameters in the documentation file.
I hope that answers your question, Divyansh. All right, so there's another question by Nicholas. Hello, note specifically related to documentation from security perspective. What are your viewpoints on using a web application firewall gateway reverse proxy to protect the APIs against layer 4 to 7 attacks on, as example, OWASP DDoS? Any experience in the enterprise segment? Also from a customer perspective who focus on operational stability and GRC, what are your experience in this matter? Yeah, any of you guys want to take it? Frank, Ankush?
Yeah. I mean, I can present my views against using a firewall. I mean, as Frank mentioned, like 70% of the traffic is bot traffic. and you would want to, in some ways, protect exposing your servers to bots. So yeah, firewalls can go a great deal, like excluded IPs, excluding the already known like marketing bots who crawl web pages. If you want to block them, firewall would be a great way to block them. DDoS, etc. They do a great job at that. Anything application specific attack, for example, if someone is trying to extract a lot of information out of your application or trying to exploit some broken authorization kind of vulnerabilities, that firewall might not be the best way. That is best done proactively in your CI/CD pipeline. That's my take, at least when it comes to layer 4 to 7 attacks.
Yeah, it's really a combination of, there's no single way to address security from an API perspective. So you need to think about, different aspects of it. The design and governance, of course, is one, but you also have the architecture. So, implementing a private network, WAF, as much as possible. Also leverage gateways, so publish your APIs to gateways, use things like rate limiting. If the implementation is connecting to a database, you put the database on the private part of the network. There's no need for it to be out and external facing. From an authentication and authorization perspective, pick the right security schemes, use secure tokens, use identity providers off the shelf rather than rolling your own, and always ensure that you rotate keys often. Ensure you scope permissions for the different API endpoints as well, and that's a very important aspect of it as well. And then, as I said, leveraging specifications also then help you to kind of lint for these things along the journey as well. And even from a production management side, you need to think about lifecycle management of that API, how you will manage versioning of it, and for consumers over a long period of time as well. There's also different techniques like contract testing, and this is kind of where you build up provider-consumer pairs. So rather than just treating the Open API specification as the total surface area, and which it is, of course, but you start building up a better picture of the subsets of that are interesting to specific consumers, and that gives you more detailed insight on what parts of your API are being used. And that can help you manage change to that API design more effectively over time, because you know who it's going to break and you know who you need to talk to around potentially deprecating the feature rather than just automatically creating a new version of an API. So lots of different tactics, but no single silver bullet, unfortunately.
Correct. There's one last question. So do you take an average specs or just the latest one? We do the latest. We export the latest Open API spec file. So we don't do average. There is another question. So best practice.
Yeah, from Nicholas again. Yeah, go ahead, Ankita.
So best practice as a baseline in implementation phase of API, perhaps a candidate for CIS benchmark best practices. I don't think I got the question. Do any of you get the question? It's in Q&A. Nicholas, you want to write more on this?
I think in general, yeah, like if there are kind of security benchmark best practices, that's where the AppSec team can really come in and support the teams that are building APIs. So the developers and the API designers, product managers who are producing APIs, and use the benchmarks that are there and your own company's opinions on what security processes are most important, and make sure that they form part of your API governance and the rule sets that you will apply to your APIs. And then you will enable those teams to proactively get feedback as early as possible in the life cycle. And it's not at the end when they're doing a security review just before releasing to production. So that's why it's all about shifting left. So yeah, as much as possible, take those benchmarks, those best practices from the company perspective and into the early phases of your API delivery lifecycle. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, but amazing thought to end the webinar on. It's all about shifting left, right? It's all about shifting left in API security. Awesome, guys. I think it's been 53 minutes. Thank you so much, Frank, for joining this webinar. It was wonderful to have you over here. And thanks who all are still here and ask these wonderful questions. We'll send a recording to all of you via email within the next 24 hours. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good day, guys.